All right. Thank you very much for keeping us company. We are heading into the interview segment tonight in studio. I am joined by the Regional Director, United Nations Volunteer. His name is Njoya Tikum. Thank you very much for coming to the program. It is a very busy week for the United Nations Volunteer, but we are going to get into that in a couple of minutes. But who is Njoya Tikum?
Well, thank you very much, Edward, for having me on KBC. This is my first time here, and I'm quite pleased to be here. I am from Cameroon originally, though the name Njoya might deceive you a little bit, being in Kenya. And I work currently as the Regional Manager for Eastern Southern Africa for the United Nations Volunteers Program. We cover the entire 23 countries in the eastern and the southern part of Africa, and literally provides and mobilize and provide space for people to come in and volunteer within the UN system.
All right. How many years have you been the regional director?
Very interesting. This is my second year. I just finished, I'm about to finish my second year. But prior to this, I worked with the United Nations Development Program in different countries and in HQ, but more recently in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, where I serve as the regional advisor on economic governance and anti-corruption issues across Africa.
You know, when you talk about Cameroon, you talk some of the things that we know is about the football. But which part of Cameroon did you grow up? The eastern side or the western side? I know it is divided in the middle in terms of language. Were you on the Anglophone side or the Francophone side?
Well, you know, I was born in Douala, which is in the Francophone side, is the economic hub of the country. But my parents hail from the northwestern side of the country, which is Bamenda. So I'm Anglophone by family. I was born in Douala, so I'm a typical Cameroonian.
All right. And the United Nations, even if you don't talk about the volunteer department, has been making inroads in Africa. It has been changing lives. Of course, we have the refugee program, we have the UNDP, we have the UNICEF. Volunteer, is it something that most people are finding hard to relate to?
Well, it's interesting you started, Edward, by talking about the lives that volunteerism has allowed people to transform in the continent. The organization itself was created in 1970. And when we were created, the mandates that we were given were twofold. One was to open space within the UN system for people from all walks of life to come in and volunteer and serve through the UN agencies to supporting development, peace, and security challenges across the world. The second mandate was actually to support member states in actually developing their own national frameworks and national schemes to promote homegrown volunteerism programs through national development plans. Now, you're asking if volunteerism in itself or if volunteers by themselves help transform lives. I think you have started off by citing the refugee program.
Yes.
Very recently, I visited Kakuma camp together with our executive coordinator to see what our volunteers were doing within the camp, but also within the communities. And Kakuma, I think, represent the best of what volunteerism and volunteers can offer generally. First, they find themselves in places where you and I probably wouldn't want to go and live. They live there. Second, they work with communities that have been completely disenfranchised, and they help bring a sense of purpose to these communities. But even more so, they help bridge the gap between the host communities and these refugees, creating that space for dialogue in these tough places. That in itself, I would say, explains the whole value of volunteerism.
Is it that you understand the field so well, or this is something that is born with you, something that you have a passion for?
I have to say, Edward, even you were born a volunteer, if you think about it. Growing up, we all, in one way or the other, had to help our parents, our communities, whether it's through community programs to clean up our schools, our hospitals. So volunteerism is inbuilt in every African, I would say. It's a value set that we grew up with. And I think when you get to a certain age, it's then up to you to decide to actualize that value set beyond your immediate community or within your community. So if you ask me the question whether or not it's something that I learned, I'd say, yeah, my mommy taught me that, or my father taught me how to give back to those who are a little bit less privileged than myself. But I think this is a common value that we see across the continent. You certainly grew up in such an environment here in Kenya. I did the same in Cameroon. And the stories that I have seen across the continent since I took this portfolio just reinforces this belief and these values that I saw growing up myself.
You know, Africa is struggling to shake off the tag unemployment.
Yeah.
And when you talk of volunteer, it involves work. So how does Africa embrace the word volunteer when it has a really huge population that is trying to get job placements?
Well, that's a very good question, because there's a little bit of a misconception in some of our countries on the continent. Some of our governments have tended to look at volunteerism as a gap filler for true unemployment or employment schemes to uplift people out of unemployment. But the truth is that volunteerism cannot replace job creation in itself. Volunteerism can serve as a vehicle through which people build their skills to be able to get into the job market, or build their skills to create jobs. You know, I met today a formidable young man, Dr. Harold, who luckily volunteered in Cameroon. And Harold is a gentleman in Kenya who is trying to tap the internet from the moon. And he gave us an expose of his project and said he's been able, through that advancement, which he gathered when he got inspired when he was in Cameroon, he's been able to come back to Kenya and develop all kinds of technological advances to get internet access to so many schools in different counties in Kenya that are completely left out by the major IT providers. Whether or not volunteerism in itself offers people a platform, or serve as a platform through which people can transform lives in our own society, is absolutely yes, I would say that.
And what would you say are some of the impediments to what you do, considering the fact that, like you said, some are looking at it as a stepping stone. Probably if I volunteer, they would consider me for a job.
Yeah.
And there are those who are actually going for the actual volunteering work.
Well, listen, whether we like it or not, we still have a continent that has perhaps the highest unemployment rate among its young people, so to say. And again, whether we like it or not, some people are going to see volunteerism as a job. That's just a fact. And some people are going to get into volunteering as a means of survival. So we first have to acknowledge that predicament. But I think the motive behind volunteerism is not necessarily financial. I don't think financial incentive is what drives people who want to go back and give to their communities. I was in South Sudan recently and met with a medical doctor who is 73 years old. And he's on retirement but came back to train the doctors in South Sudan. I met with a Ugandan lady who is a midwife, left whatever she was doing in Uganda and went to South Sudan, and has been there for almost 4 years, training young midwives in South Sudan. But does that mean that at the core of it, people still do not see it as a means through which they can get the skills, they can get the jobs? No. Our appeal to government is that if you structure volunteerism properly, if you put in place the right system, the right frameworks, the right regulatory standards, then people can use the skills that they accumulate from volunteering to help them find jobs. I give you a simple example. If you are a peace mediator and you choose to go and volunteer in a place like South Sudan, or again in Kakuma, where every single morning you get up and try to bring communities together. You get up and try to organize things. You get up and try to get people to speak to each other. After serving there for 2 to 3 years, I bet you won't have issues getting a job with an organization that is looking for community organizers. So you must have accumulated enough skills to help you get the kind of job that you're looking for. Whether or not this is the primary motive, I would say within young people, this is an excellent motive. It should be a motive. There's nothing wrong with that. In giving back, you want to also receive something. So I think volunteerism in itself serves as a vehicle for skills development. But more and more what we are seeing in Africa is that people are also using it as a gap filler for income generation. You know, I don't primarily think that should be the motive, but it's there. It's a reality. It's about 2% of our African workforce right now. The report that we published last year said 1 billion people around the world volunteer each year. probably 480 or 490 million in Africa, formally and informally. Now, if you equate that to the way our GDP is structured, you realize this is perhaps 3 to 4% of the GDP of a country. The workforce that is created through volunteerism can make up to 2 to 3 to 4% of the GDP of a country. Right. So we cannot dispense or completely sideline the fact that volunteerism is seen as a job, can lead to jobs, but more so I think what you and I should push for is the true value of volunteerism, which is that which creates a platform for people who are traditionally left behind to be included in development processes, in peace-building processes, in climate-resilient processes.
Right. You have been there for 2 years, and we have two sets of people. One who is employed, the other one is unemployed. Mm-hmm. Within these 2 years, which set have you encountered?
Well, it depends, right? I'd say in our sub-region, we see both, to be very honest with you. When we had the cyclone in Mozambique recently, we saw people who left behind what they were doing to go down to Mozambique and help with immediate, emergency relief efforts. But we also see a lot more young graduates who are just leaving school, trying to get a job, not having anything to do, but opting to spend that gap year in volunteering and giving back to their community. Some of them motivated by the financial reward, but I have to say, almost 90% of the volunteerism that happens has nothing to do with money, because these people volunteer in places where they don't make money, they don't earn anything. Now, if you only look at volunteerism from the prism of the United Nations volunteer or some of the institutionalized volunteerism mechanisms, then you start talking about incentive. But that is just perhaps 2% of overall volunteers around the world. The majority of Africans and global citizens that volunteer in communities where they do not make any financial reward. They spend a lot of time giving back. But the sacrosanct issue is that they recognize, for the younger ones, they recognize that it is an important element and a pathway for them to get the skills that they need to survive in life tomorrow.
Most of us have really humble beginnings.
Yeah.
Did you see yourself doing what you're doing now?
Oh, no, of course not. Growing up, I thought I was going to be a footballer. As many Cameroonians in the past thought, I thought I was going to be the next Roger Miller of my country. Mm-hmm. But, I was educated as an attorney in my own country. And life being what it is, I found my calling in joining the UN system to try and also give back. Precisely within the UN system, open the doors of the UN system to bring in more people who would like to contribute to development processes, to work with our governments, to try and address some of the development challenges that we see. Was this a childhood dream? Obviously not. Like you, I grew up in a small village also. So and I used to tell people, growing up, the two United Nations agencies I recognized were UNICEF, because every child in my neighborhood had a UNICEF T-shirt. And the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, because I think in them, I really saw the UN in action. I felt if I was going to grow up and join an agency, it would be the Refugee Agency, because the level of empathy that my colleagues in UN Refugee Agency portrays on a daily basis is what actually attracted me to the UN. But then I joined the UN Development Program, and today here I am with the UN Volunteers Program.
And when someone reads your profile, they see someone who is pro-Africa, pro-progress, and one of the issues that you try to talk about is corruption, how Africa can rid itself of this vice that has been blamed on a lot of things, economy-wise. How do we move towards a future that is free of corruption, that is free of nepotism, that is going to be taking care of its children?
Well, listen, corruption is really an unfortunate situation that has befallen Africa, I have to say. The former South African President, Thabo Mbeki, I think in 2014, led a panel, high-level panel that published a report on illicit financial flow. And the report at the time indicated that annually $50 billion departs the continent illicitly, right? That's money that we could have used to build our schools, our roads, but it's money that we could also have used to build our hospitals. Now, the irony is that most of the focus on corruption has been on petty corruption, what I call petty corruption. The police guy on the road, the teacher in school, that's important. That's really killing the continent. But I think the aspect that has been left blind for quite a while is the corruption that is perpetuated by multilateral companies, transnational corporations, dealing in Africa, not paying their taxes, looking at all the tax loopholes and avoiding them, and the amount of money that our own kleptocrats take out of the continent is the aspect of corruption that we haven't, as a continent, paid so much attention to. Whether or not we get out of this quagmire, I don't know. I think it would require massive citizen mobilization. I am hoping that those of our colleagues who are volunteering in the social accountability space will take up this challenge and begin to hold our government and our community leaders accountable for the resources that are allocated, from national to county level.
All right. Finally, I know that we don't have a lot of time, but the World Volunteers Day tomorrow, briefly.
Well, I'm quite excited about tomorrow. Tomorrow we are organizing the very first sub-regional International Volunteers Day in Kenya. We're bringing people from 15 other countries. We have gone through a process and selected real champions of volunteers in 15 countries in the sub-region, and we would be recognizing them tomorrow. But in addition to that, we're working with our partners at One Campaign, VSO Society, VSO in Kenya, Red Cross, and of course the government, the Ministry of Labor in particular, to recognize Kenyans who have also throughout the year been doing good in their own society. We started on the 2nd, we've had multiple events, and tomorrow is a culmination of these different events, and we're going to have this big festival. Traditionally we celebrate International Volunteers Day in a conference room in a hotel, and people, it's as if we are afraid or we are ashamed to celebrate our own volunteers. This time we are taking it to the Nairobi Railway Club. We are hoping that the entire public would join us. We have some musicians and artists that have volunteered to come and perform, Kidum, Fena, and Chris Martin. Yes. So I'm hoping that the entire Kenya would be there with us tomorrow to celebrate.
All right, and the hashtag?
First of all, the theme is Volunteer for an Inclusive Future. Volunteerism provides a platform for everybody. So IVD, hashtag IVD 2019.
All right, thank you very much, Njoya.
Thank you so much.
Of course, you always should feel at home. Njoya is a Kenyan name.
I figured. Thanks a lot.
African name. All right, that does it for us. Business News is up next.